Hello, and welcome to my presentation. As an early career performer musicologist, I've been struck by the lack of meaningful interaction between empirical performance analysis and practice as research. While the musicological subdiscipline of analysis and performance, formalized by authors such as Edward Cohn and Wallace Berry, is now widely recognized, coming in from stern criticism from some quarters for its authoritarian tone and subordination of performer agency, the parallel discipline of performance analysis and performance has yet to be established, in spite of much innovation and progress in the field of empirical performance research in the last 30 years. My current research methodology, centering on the performance practice of Stockhausen's Klavierstücke, aims to address this lacuna, taking inspiration from recent progressive contributions in the field of analysis and performance, such as Daphne Leong's 20th Century Music in Analysis and Performance, written chapter by chapter in collaboration with a wide range of performers and composers. Aside from exploring repertoire often overlooked in the field, and including the voices of active musicians, Leong's study takes the crucial step, aided by modern technology, of bringing her suggestions to life, with new recordings by her and her collaborators documented in audio and video clips, and compared with excerpts from the existing performance tradition, all available via an easy-to-use companion website. It is my aim to pursue a similarly autoethnographic documentary course, using empirical performance analysis, rather than technical theoretical analysis, as the principal source of inspiration for new recordings and experimental approaches to performance. Today, I will discuss the methodology and present the results of my PhD case study on Stockhausen's Klavierstück 1. This piece is well suited to my aims for a number of reasons. First, it is a seminal piece of early 1950s serialism, which has come in for considerable critical debate for the complexity of its notation, offering a rich context in which to frame my research. Second, the complexity and inherent ambiguity of the score, to be discussed in due course, make for unusual and often surprising performative results, whose clarification may be of benefit for audiences and performers alike. Third, it is relatively short, with most performances lasting around 3 minutes. This means that while elements of the score and the performance analysis process may be complicated and challenging, it is still possible to engage with the piece and its performances as a whole. Finally, and perhaps most importantly, unlike the majority of early serial works, Klavierstück 1 now has a substantial corpus of recordings, dating back to the mid-1950s, with new recordings still being released. Here is a chronological discography of currently available recordings. As you can see, recordings of Klavierstück 1 have been released regularly over the course of the last 60 years, providing an excellent performance history of the piece. Klavierstück 1 is infamous for its use of so-called irrational rhythms, complex non-binary divisions which can now be more neutrally described using the contemporary nomenclature of tuplets and nested tuplets. Today, I will be focusing on the first 8 bars of the piece. As you can see, all except for bars 3 and 5 contain tuplets and/or nested tuplets. These representative bars also highlight Stockhausen's highly variegated, non-idiomatic dynamic markings and disparate distribution of pitch material. Finally, Stockhausen's direction to perform the piece as fast as possible according to the smallest note values introduces ambiguity to this complex mix. The smallest note values occur in the second nested tuplet grouping of bar 6, making this what I term the crux of the piece. As you can see, apart from small and highly complex fractional values, this bar contains a challenging succession of fortissimo and triple fortissimo markings, in addition to one fortissimo sforzando in the low bass, as well as highly disparate distribution of pitch material, with no indication of articulation or phrasing, save for the suggestive beaming of the groups. The technical challenges of the crux are thus manifold, simultaneously calling, at least in theory, for complex rhythmic proportioning, management of enormous leaps, and nuanced distinctions of extremely loud dynamics. This combination of demands, and their supposed relation to the bass tempo of the performance as a whole, soon became the focus of my analysis. The principal aims and interests of my analysis were to find out first how accurately performers' bass tempi were calibrated with their crux tempi, Second, how accurately complex rhythms were realized, both in crux and non-crux contexts. Third, how accurately dynamic contrasts were realized. And finally, what effect all of this has for the listener, in combination with the performer's broader expressive approach. My first step was to track all 259 durational onsets of the piece for each performer. I was then able to work out a bass tempo for each performance, with the following results. As you can see, Stockhausen's ambiguous as fast as possible direction has led to a wide range of tempi. These can be divided into slow, moderate, and fast performance types, highlighted here in yellow, blue, and red. As the following chart shows in ascending order of crux tempo, Wambach, Moselle, and Mersennier's bass tempi are very closely calibrated with those of their respective cruxes. Interestingly, Klein, who had the fastest bass tempo, plays the crux slower than any other performer, whereas Tudor, who recorded the second fastest bass tempo, plays his crux even faster. Finally, Henk, who had the slowest bass tempo, plays his crux significantly faster. Now, let's listen to the effect of Tudor and Henk's contrasting approaches in context. First, here is Tudor's performance of bars 1 to 8. As you will hear, his wild and virtuosic performance of the crux is reflected in his treatment of surrounding material, contributing to the consistently visceral intensity of his interpretation. Now listen to the eruptive quality of Henk's crux in the context of his slow bass tempo, and the rhythmic and timbral details revealed in his performance at this more controlled speed. As you can hear, neither Tudor nor Henk perform anything approaching the notated nested tuplet rhythm, as illustrated by the tempo graph. Nor do they realize the notated dynamic contrasts. This is true to a greater or lesser extent in all of the recordings, with a huge amount of gestural variety revealed when the recordings are slowed down. This shows that performing the crux and other similarly complex sequences in the piece gesturally, that is, in rapid bursts, choreographed by the physical distribution of the pitches, while sacrificing dynamic contrasts, has become an aurally and orally mediated part of the performance tradition, with no explicit directions in the score to perform in this way. These consistent discrepancies with the letter of the score were the starting place for my 3 new experimental recordings. My plan was to generate precise empirical bass tempi from performances of the crux according to 3 different criteria of possibility, whose principles would then be applied across the performance at the calibrated tempo. First, I plan to investigate the fastest combination of gestures and produce an empirically calibrated traditional performance type. Second, I plan to investigate the reduction in speed necessary to perform the crux with the rhythm as notated, or at least non-gesturally, with relatively equal note values. And finally, to investigate the reduction in speed and the gestural configuration necessary to achieve clear and accurate dynamic contrasts in the crux. Throughout these versions, I aim to maintain a consistent artistic approach, according to my preference for line, connectivity, and localized detail, as opposed to emulating, say, the visceral style of Tudor, or the relatively objective style of Alois Kontarski in the name of historically informed performance. My methodology involved first analyzing and practicing different gestural combinations within the crux according to each criterion of possibility. I then recorded different combinations 5 times in succession without errors, calculating an average bass tempo from the results, and subsequently applying the fastest bass tempo across the performance with the aid of counting tapes and tempo substitutions. I then recorded 3 unbroken takes of each different version in separate recording sessions, allowing time to adjust to the tempo and technical demands of each interpretation. Here are extracts from the 5-fold repetitions of the 2 different configurations I prepared for the gestural performance type. First, repetitions of gestural configuration 1. And here are repetitions of gestural configuration 2. Listen carefully for the change at the center of the crux. These recordings produced the following results, with the first configuration determining the fastest bass speed of 42.66 crotchet beats per minute, but with a higher standard deviation between takes. For reference, this would constitute a moderate performance type, approximately the same bass speed as Ellen Korver. Now, here is the first gestural configuration in context from take 1 of my recordings. As you can see, all 3 takes had very similar bass tempi, all slightly slower than my preparation tempo, which may have been influenced by my natural adjustment to the acoustic of the concert hall in which I made the recording. The next graph shows my variation between takes, highlighting small differences in the first phases of the crux and hurrying of the final gesture in take 3. While these differences may be difficult to perceive, they all contribute to the subtle variation of the crux as a whole, illustrating the natural presence of personal variation between takes and the aesthetic importance of repeated live performances. Finally, I compared my bass tempo with my crux tempo. To my surprise, this revealed the same considerable proportionate slowing in every take that I had witnessed in the majority of the recorded tradition. This constituted the failure of my attempt at empirical determination and calibration. Before moving on, however, I decided to record a second gestural version, with a lower bass speed of 39 beats per minute, which led to much more precise calibration, particularly in the first and second takes, albeit still marginally slower. This highlighted the need to take performance nerves and acoustics into consideration when determining my bass tempo. I was also anxious to perform the crux consistently without mistakes, taking the literalist view that errors would constitute performing faster than possible. Had I risked the possibility of wrong notes and/or splashy attacks, as Tudor, among others, does, I could have produced a more visceral and precisely calibrated crux performance within the context of my initial bass tempo. I will now illustrate my rhythmically accurate performance of the crux using video demonstrations. As you will see and hear, groups sitting comfortably under the hand are now relatively straightforward, with even execution of the larger leaps determining the overall speed. Here it is first at slow speed. And now at full speed. As before, I performed this version of the crux in isolation 5 times, determining an average bass speed of 31.5 beats per minute, significantly slower than Henk's 35 beats per minute, the slowest performance on record. Here it is in context. As you'll hear, apart from the aesthetic difference of the slower tempo on the surrounding material, the crux has a radically different aspect when performed rhythmically, affecting a change in density rather than intensity, particularly when juxtaposed with the slower periodic values of bar 7. As you can see, because of an audio quality issue on one of the takes, I made 4 statistically usable versions rather than 3. Just as with my gestural performance, each take was consistent in tempo and marginally slower than my preparation speed. However, unlike my gestural performance, my crux tempo was significantly faster than my bass tempo in every case, particularly in take 1, highlighting my increased confidence in performance and increasing the visceral effect of the crux in the context of the slower surrounding material. Finally, while not precisely terraced according to the nested values, the following graph shows the relative consistency of my rhythmically accurate version in contrast with the gestures of my traditional version. I concluded that to achieve an accurate terracing of the two groups of nested values would have required a further radical reduction in tempo. Lastly, here is a video demonstration of my dynamically accurate crux at slow speed, including buttressing and preparation of the fingers to execute the fortissimo sforzando in the bass. And now here it is at full speed. My bass tempo for this final version was the extremely slow 27 crotchet beats per minute. Here now is the crux in context. As you'll hear, the radically slower tempo creates an almost meditative atmosphere, allowing for greater focus on the harmonic accumulation of tones, rhythmic details, and dynamic contrasts. As you'll hear, I also experimented with performing the bar 5 dyad, held by the sostenuto pedal an octave lower, to avoid the blurring created by the repetition of these tones in traditional performances of the crux. As the chart shows, this was the only performance type where my bass tempo in the recording was higher than my preparation tempo. This reflected my artistic feeling that I had reached the lowest speed at which I could perform the piece coherently. Unsurprisingly, as a result, the crux was considerably slower than the bass tempo in each take, and also slower than my preparation tempo, showing the same added caution that I'd applied in my traditional gestural performance. Overall, I was very satisfied with my experimental rhythmic and dynamic recordings. which I consider to be radical departures from the performance tradition, stimulated by empirical analysis and technically faithful to the letter of the score. Empirical tempo determination proved to be fallible, highlighting the limits of rationalized practice, but remained useful both as a practice tool and as a means of investigating new modes of performance. Along the way, I hope to have clarified the complexity of the music for readers and audiences by focusing listening in complex passages and illustrating the relationship between performance decisions and aesthetic effect in local and global contexts. I am now exploring ways to adapt this methodology to case studies on Stockhausen's Klavierstücke 7 and 10, with ambitious hopes for the transferability of my approach and for the future of performance analysis and performance as a musicological discipline.
Hello, I'm Jen from the London College of Music in the UK, and welcome to my presentation, JEDUF, Jitters and Justification, Qualitative Exploration for Contemporary String Quartet Phenomenon. It isn't new that research questions should inform methodology, but what happens when your research is of an unstudied contemporary performance phenomenon within Western classical music? I'm just ending the first year of my music PhD research into such an area. With a lack of methodological precedent, I have been on a journey full of jitters, some of which I wish to share with you now. So firstly, my research question. This asks, what position does real-time interactive technology take in Linson and Clark's distributed creativity interface in string quartet performance? Now, to make sense of that, I'll just break it down briefly into its three elements. So string quartet performance is as per the classical ensemble with a focus on performance. Real-time interactive technology is a type of technology whereby the musician asks the technology to do something and the technology instantly responds in live performance to have an impact upon the music itself, and the focus is on performer input and interaction. Distributed creativity is a 2017 creativity theory by Linson and Clark, which presents creativity as an interface between the skills of performers, the ability of their human bodies and instruments, and culturally conditioned performance practice and musical materials. This photo gives you an example of all of that in reality. The string quartet here are performing with EEG headsets, and they recently performed a piece of music called Human Subjects by Pampin and Karpen. One element of that piece involved real-time data from brainwave rhythm being sonified and sent back to the players via headphones with the aim for them to imitate it. The closer the imitation, the louder the dynamic of their instrument output via speakers. Now, in trying to understand what happens in this kind of novel performance situation, any data might be important, so being restrictive in initial research design may cause evidence to be missed and or misinterpreted. So I was already worried about the implications this had for methodology. So, some huge jitters for me, feelings of extreme nervousness. How could I have a flexible methodological approach that could also be credible and have data depth and rigour? And how can I enable a performer-participant focus whilst also answering a specific research question? I had to somehow balance these dichotomies, but before I could even consider how to achieve this, it seemed I was about to go on a whole jitter journey. It was clear that I needed an inductive approach, collecting data relevant to my topic, analysing it, and then generating theory. And a performer focus required exploratory qualitative methods which used empirical tools. These tools enable direct or indirect observation or experience, and I'll come back to these shortly. Despite this all seeming obvious, my literature review found that qualitative methods in the study of Western classical music were not very established. This is echoed in some existing string quartet ensemble studies. For example, Bailey states that she is attempting to reverse this trend in her use of ethnomusicological methods. Chiara and Höfting state that hardly any relevant sources were available on the subject of phenomenology of expert musicianship. And Mack shows that qualitative methods mostly firstly appeared in the UK through more recent AHRC research centres, like the one that Distributed Creativity came from. So, at this point I realised that I'd chosen not only an original topic for my PhD research, but that I was also headed further into the unknown with methodology. In addition, it became apparent that making qualitative research credible was also a challenge. It has no universal standards, terminology, or criteria by which to evaluate its quality. Instead of being able to pluck a well-established black and white scientific tool out of a textbook, I was kind of left going, ah. I have a social sciences background, which means for me, interdisciplinarity isn't a new idea as such. However, again, I discovered a lack of precedent, and particularly so in performance research. In other string quartet studies, Good and Davidson conclude that music researchers have focused on an individual factor, such as the historical, musicological, or psychosocial, at the expense of how these individual elements interact. And Bailey suggests that disciplines should not compete, but combine in stronger rehearsal and performance research, something which she calls complementarity. This was something that clearly seemed a good idea, but again not established, so yet more jitters. However, it seemed justifiable for more than one reason. Distributed creativity itself encompasses social, material, and cultural aspects in a relational way, and each of these have their own theories. Performance is about interacting and doing in an environment, which also covers a lot of theoretical ground. Plus, my research considers human interaction with technology, which has a whole host of theory of its own. Bourne's relational musicology provided me with a safety net. It is about music and its social aspects being considered as interwoven rather than as separate sub-disciplines within music. Bourne considers how musical categories are developed and to what cultural, social and aesthetic purposes they are put. This involves having a conception of music which is relational, reflexive, social and material, and also realising that other disciplines can contribute. This rhetoric tied in with my justifications. Although Bourne provides specific applications of her relational method, it's the integrated ideology that's key to my research. Therefore, I decided that merging it with the empirical tools would provide a holistic approach for understanding my performance phenomenon. So, onto those empirical tools, and specifically fieldwork, or the study of persons making music. This is something that ethnomusicology could offer my research. It uses a variety of participant observation methods, usually in situ, to enable the researcher to learn about specifics of the music as it is performed and to observe musical social conduct. The study of music from its ethnic context can enable music to be seen as a process and social act. Although Stock, among others, argues that ethnomusicology can be a powerful research methodology for other musicologists, its methods are still comparatively scarce within Western classical music study, something Bailey acknowledges in an article whose introduction is even called the interface between ethnomusicology and musicology. So again, I was having a case of the jitters. My justifications for utilising fieldwork included relational musicology's viewing of music and social aspects as interwoven, Linson and Clark acknowledging that studies involving the situated nature of musicking, the crate that you can see off on the screen, informing part of their approach within their own distributed creativity. I was seeking a performer-participant focus that obviously had to engage with these people, and it allows access to phenomena for which there may be limited or no existing literature. But whilst researching ethnomusicology, I thought it was interesting that Berger and Stone see more recent ethnomusicology as showing a trend towards interpretation and analysis. My research was to do exactly that, use theory and seek broader insights into musical practices. And this seemed to also align with relational musicology. So a little more confidence boosting justification there. To briefly summarise so far, all aspects of my methodology were individually unusual to differing degrees in terms of studying Western classical music, and they certainly hadn't been put together. Although their integration made sense, this was still pretty scary stuff for a new PhD candidate, and that credibility issue was still hanging around. The jitters had snowballed, fiver paranoia had well and truly set in, and I still had to deal with those earlier dichotomies, flexible but credible, and participant-led but research questions specific. It was clear at an early stage that whatever I was going to find out in my research was going to emerge. Participants were going to share their insights and practice, and I had no idea what would be in my data, no idea what theories outside of music would be relevant, and no hypothesis regarding the theory I would generate myself. A huge exploration, a potentially exciting, organic and magical process. But hang on, I had a specific research question to answer, I had a deadline, I had a budget, I didn't have unlimited tools and knowledge at my disposal, and actually, even if I did, it would be overwhelming. The word itself, emergent, can also prove to be a little dangerous, as according to my research paradigm, truth is constructed and cannot purely emerge. Then along came JEDUF. I stumbled across JEDUF whilst frantically doing literature review searching about emergent research. I found affinity with this acronym from adaptive coding project management. I'll just stress at this point that despite my research topic, I'm not an expert in computers or technology, so this really was new to me. JEDUF, or Just Enough Design Up Front, provides a foundational overarching design based on priorities from which smaller and more detailed adaptive planning can occur. For me, it aligned with thoughts about qualitative research in general, in that, as Maxwell describes, it simply requires a broader and less restrictive concept of design. JEDUF was catchy, straightforward, and accessible, and an easier way for me to grasp emergent research design, which Palethorpe describes as the ability to adapt to new ideas, concepts, or findings that arise whilst conducting qualitative research. Essentially, my project could have a flexible methodological design in which the detailed aspects emerge during the research. Being able to act upon information that's unanticipated seemed ideal for a situation in which I didn't know what would actually happen. It could also enable data richness and complement a holistic approach. Therefore, I planned an overarching case study design, something described by Robson and McCartan as a strategy for doing research which involves an empirical investigation of a particular contemporary phenomenon within its real-life context using multiple evidence sources. A perfect fit for my needs. This slide shows the overarching design of my data collection priorities. I would use practice-led experimentation, interviews, observations, and other primary and secondary source materials as appropriate. When we look at the data analysis schedule along with this, you can begin to see how the data itself shapes some of the design. The diagram also really shows the logical integration of my research design, and in fact it took for me to draw it to really see that for myself. So data were thematically analysed after each stage of collection using only emergent coding, an open bottom-up approach which is participant-led with no application of theoretical ideas. The results from this would then be used to inform further data collection. So, for example, you can see that the first ensemble interview data would lead me to additional primary and secondary sources, and that themes emerging from this and the video observations could be put to the musicians in the final interviews with them. After all of this, I would carry out template coding. This is a top-down approach in which I could draw concepts which directly related to my research question and key literature. Having a combined coding approach for me provided a solution to the participant versus research dichotomy, so that was one more jitter resolved. I lastly incorporate what Yin described as analytic generalization, where the results of a case study are compared to existing theory. Themes and narratives from the data would be considered against distributed creativity and conceptualized as appropriate by considering other relevant theories. Doing so at this point provided the opportunity to engage with the most recent literature to answer my research question. Although a pluralistic approach to theory would be limited to my scope of knowledge, it meant I could examine the data as fully as possible, especially as it was an unstudied phenomenon. Considering a variety of theories would mean that analysis wouldn't be distorted by trying to squeeze it into one existing theory. It could also illuminate relationships that might otherwise have been misunderstood or gone unnoticed altogether. So finding comfort in JEDUF and having knitted everything together as per this diagram, I finally felt confident, However, the credibility factor was still niggling away at me, and I was keen to show that my research had this. Admittedly, seeking something so objective as may be a contradiction in qualitative research, but as a minimum, I felt it would go some way to evidence the general ethical research principles we're all obliged to follow: honesty, accuracy, and integrity. Therefore, I incorporated criteria by Lincoln and Guber into my research design. Although somewhat dated, these criteria have been used by many and stood the test of time. The next couple of slides show how I incorporated their techniques. I won't go into all of the detail here, but to briefly explain their terms, credibility is about providing confidence in the truth of research results. Transferability means that findings have applicability in other contexts. Dependability shows that findings are consistent and repeatable, and confirmability is about the extent to which research findings are shaped by the participants as opposed to any researcher bias. Lincoln and Guber explain that their techniques are essentially methodological and deriving from disciplines such as sociology and anthropology. This further ties in with the relational musicology and ethnomusicological aspects of my research. Lincoln and Guber's confirmability required me to be reflexive about my impact on the research process. Some more jitters crept in here as my position was a bit blurry. I was a violinist, having performed in string quartet ensembles, and would be engaging in practice-led experimentation with technology. So I had an insider view from which to make interpretations according to the indigenous knowledge. However, in not directly participating in the data collection as a performer, I was simultaneously an outsider. This integrated emimetic approach had tensions to be managed. My insights should not become what Maxwell describes as a license to impose my own values uncritically on the research. I had to remember that cultures develop over time in a complex way, and that the participants and I had different journeys relating to the research topic. Using Lincoln and Guber's framework went some way to address this, and some wise words from Bailey further provided focus and relaxed my jitters. I was to capture rather than to contribute to. I expected to be making concluding remarks at this point in my presentation, but it turns out I was not to be free from the jitters for long, and ironically, my flexible research design was required to be even more flexible as the COVID-19 pandemic arose. Face-to-face contact and live observation of performing musicians was no longer possible, and thinking back to my flow diagram, this was the bulk of my data collection. I made some provisional contingency plan inquiries and was overwhelmed by the response, and the saying, if you don't ask, you don't get, really seems true in my case. A senior research scientist for the American Institute for Disease Modeling, and therefore COVID-19 hero by day, composer by night, agreed to participate in my research and provided information about a recording of his work for string quartet and EEG headsets. And professors at the University of Washington were happy to both participate in and provide existing data from a 3-year collaborative project, which you saw some of in the earlier photo. The relevant performers are also happy to participate in my research. Interviews, transcripts, and existing visual and audio data could be dealt with electronically. Although this had some limitations, these can be acknowledged. So ironically, I'm now in a position whereby I've recruited more participants than originally intended, have access to more and potentially better quality data than originally planned. I'm collaborating with people more widely, including internationally, and actually now have jittery excitement rather than fear. So for me, lockdown has provided a different yet positive research situation to examine what role real-time interactive technology has in Linson and Clark's distributed creativity interface in string quartet performance. In summary, a lack of methodological precedent for my research resulted in my having several cases of the jitters. In fact, I went through all of the emotions on this slide, if not more, and my supervisor can testify to that. It made for a challenging and time-consuming navigation through a series of methodological decisions, and has actually taken up the biggest proportion of my PhD time to date. It was one thing to have an original research topic, but to have to make several methodological leaps was really confronting. In researching an unstudied contemporary performance phenomenon within Western classical music, it became apparent that qualitative methods, ethnomusicology, and relational musicology were scarce. In my mind, I needed to articulate clear justifications for their use, above and beyond what might normally be the case for a research project. I also wanted to prove credibility before I felt confident in my integrated approach and the ability to defend it. Although all PhD research projects can be said to evolve to differing degrees, emergent design in my case was about making a solid commitment to that ethos in a proper methodological way. It is something that has permeated not only data collection and analysis, but also the research concept and ideas, process along the way, and conclusions. My JEDUF journey of discovery has led me to conclude that music embracing non-standard aspects requires tailored approaches to research, and that as music researchers, we should welcome what this could bring and not have to feel those jitters. So just a couple of slides of key references. And thank you everyone for listening.
This presentation and the future paper will deal dominantly with the topics specially emphasizing technology, methodology, and inter-transdisciplinary collaborations in contemporary ethnomusicology. It arises from my PhD research of specific articulation components, predominantly timbre, in describing dominant musical style and vocal practice of Serbs from the Pešter Plateau area in southwestern Serbia. During years of research in the traditional singing of Serbs from Pešter, I have discovered that there are, on the sound quality level, specific nuanced particularities mirrored in the manner of performance, posture of the voice, which I have begun to notice during the performances as something different in comparison to the vocal practices on the nearby areas, like Montenegro, for example. When I try to talk about that with the people in the field, I receive the confirmation for my doubts and impressions. I was asking, is that singing a kind of a Montenegrin singing and vocal dialect? And I received different answers. Many of my informants said, yes, we here are closer to Montenegro hills, and so yes, it is similar, but it is not the same. The most informative and I would say a picturesque answer was given to me by Mr. Vukosav Popadić from the village of Bujevo, who said, but Pešter has its way of the voice. Pešter ima svoj način glasa. Although there are the same melodic models or invariants sung both in Pešter and northern Montenegro, in all testimonies there was always a claim that there is something in the manner of singing, the intensity and posture of the voice that is different and specific exclusively for Serbian Pešter singing. They already seemed to know what I was talking about, and thanks to their comments and impressions, I was encouraged to continue to investigate what would that something be. Already in my master thesis, dealing also with the vocal practice of Serbs from Pešter Plateau, I was writing about the phenomenon which was named the timbre intonation back then, based on the theoretical setting of Boris Vladimirovich Asafiev. This phrase refers to the specific articulation features embodied primarily in the intensity of singing and specific singing manner, but back then without further elaboration. As I continued with the idea of importance of musical articulation, I was faced with the fact that in Serbian ethnomusicology, but in ethnomusicology in general, almost no one was dealing with the analysis of the stylistic musical components and elements of musical articulation in the manner of performance. Occasional comments and superficial descriptions in several sentences became the model for the speech about articulation of performances. Another reason for dealing with performance articulation in traditional music was because my experience and impressions from the field says that no other musical component participates so strongly in our musical experience. That confirmed as a fact during the research process in the concrete situation of the analyzed music, both for me as a researcher and for the performers or the holders of the tradition. So, on the one hand, we have one of the most informative music parameter whose activation we can all detect and hear, and on the other hand, what could possibly be more difficult than to talk about and analyze timbre, for example. These days, the computational and digital technology is so advanced and affordable that it gives us plenty of opportunities to deal with the parameters of sound that seemed unanalyzable only 50 years ago. And it is only because of the lack of time and space why I will not mention all the people ethnomusicologists who were dealing with the specificities of the tone and try to measure some components of articulation and style as well, such were Ellis, Seeger, Lomax, and many others through the history of ethnomusicology. So articulation will be defined here as a set of sound components, timbre, dynamics, agogics, general manner of performance, which materializes the musical essence of the elaborated musical tradition. The definition of timbre is even more difficult to suggest, and for now, since the thesis writing is still ongoing, I took the definition suggested by Megan Levengood in her PhD thesis, A New Approach of the Analysis of Timbre. So the timbre is an analytical domain shaped by spectral, temporal, and spectrotemporal elements of a sound signal, and also by culture and history. And what I would rather say is by a surrounding cultural and social context, the moment of performance, and performers and perceivers, mind and experiences. This is one of the reasons why there are not many people analyzing timbre, for example. It is difficult, and there is not a single element in a musical continuum which could be taken out or clearly separated from the other elements and measured. It is also dependent on multitude of features, so many variables and parameters to be taken into account. After quite detailed insight into the available literature, I have decided that it would be the best to analyze articulation in performed songs throughout the spectral display of the frequency in time in combination with a waveform. And it was necessary to make a kind of methodological framework for the process of analysis. Once I started to read and dived into the literature, I was surprised how many publications were dedicated to timbre exclusively. Many scientists from different fields have been writing about timbre and the possible ways of its perception and analysis. There is an enormous and still growing field of the MIR, Music Information Retrieval community, also dealing with timbre from the most different perspectives and widely interdisciplinary. More informations are given on the link towards website I'm directing here on the slide, and also a variety of a PhD thesis in the domain of analyzing timbre and other articulatory elements of music. Only 2 years ago, there was a conference held dedicated exclusively to timbre. Timbre is a many splendor thing, 2018, held at the McGill University of Montreal, Quebec. Amongst other researchers, opening announcement was given by Stephen McAdams, who is a pioneer in the research of musical timbre in the domain of cognitive and experimental psychology, specially dedicated to the possibilities of orchestration. Emily Dolan, musicologist from the Harvard University, and Cornelia Fales, ethnomusicologist from the Indiana University, gave useful insights and new information about the possibilities of exploring timbre in domains of musicology and ethnomusicology. There is also a link towards all mentioned lectures. And now I've just felt that it is necessary to introduce just a slight and basic information about the worldwide community dealing, analyzing, and applying the interdisciplinary approaches in different sciences in order to define and explore acoustic and perceptual properties of sound in its different manifestations and utilizations. Not only scholars from the USA, but from Scandinavian countries, France, Germany, Russia, other far Asian countries, and India as well. In choosing the suitable software for analysis, I was guided by very practical reasons, because in autumn 2019 I attended a workshop of Professor Nico Schiller from the Texas University, who spoke about the usage of the sonic visualizer software for sound analysis. And I tried to work with this software, and I discovered that it suits me pretty much for what my investigation purposes were. And then I exchanged several emails with Professor Schiller as well for a technical advice, which for me is also significant since my previous experience, I have to say, with the sound analysis of any kind and the sound editing was almost none. So I will now play one of the characteristic examples of singing of Serbs from Pešter, recorded in 2009 during the St. Peter's Day celebration in the village of Boljare. I started the analysis by importing the audio file into the software. Then I have to set the parameters, pans, waveform, and the spectrogram. The first pan I was working with is a waveform by inserting the time instant layer, the purple bars. I decided to put a new time instant bar on every syllable. Once I have set the time instants, I will have to deal with labeling them in order to be able to export some measurable results. So I numbered every new item with the duration since the previous one. By exporting the results as the annotation layer, I will get the numbers in the Excel table. Now, I can compare the time domain of sung syllables in every example. And this is also useful when elaborating the different temporal stages of pitch, onset, transient, and the decay, which will be explained later on. You will notice that in the example chosen, there are longer held syllables at the places of melodic caesura. For this occasion, I presented one of the typical Pešter melodic models found also in Montenegro, with a characteristic inversion in the sung text. The second part of the verse, octosyllabic, symmetrically octosyllabic in this case, is presented first, and then the whole verse is repeated in the correct order. What is also characteristic of the Serbian Pešter singing is the solo tutti conception. When the other singers enter the song, tempo is becoming significantly slower. The tight throat during the performance and specific shaping of the resonating air in the mouth are causing that the features of we are seeing on the spectral display, the acoustic features, and by that I mean the lower harmonics and the lower formants, are active and visible so much that sometimes appears that one of the harmonics is actually the fundamental. Terms I'm using are taken from the acoustics, and the difference between the overtones or harmonics and the formants is that overtones are the consequence of the sound source vibration, the vocal cords, and the formants are the result of the resonator's air vibration. In the vocal music, both these categories have enormous influence into the final outcome, as it will become clear here at the example of the Serbian Pešter vocal style. I have chosen to present one example from Pešter, village of Boljare, and the other one from Montenegro, two different songs from the neighboring areas which are very similar in order to showcase that a very nuanced differences exists in the domain of temporal elements and articulatory performative elements. Of course, my experience is not based only upon these two examples, rather on a dozen analyzed songs. Such a comparison was also a purpose to show the effectiveness of the spectral display in discovering tiny specificities in the manner of performance. On these screenshots, there are selected areas in both examples with the longer held vowels, and the activation of the first overtone is visible in both cases. However, activation of the formants is quite different, among other things, and you can see that the first formant is much more activated in the example from the Pester. Due to the fact that spectrogram offers a significant amount of information, analytical tools and methodology have to be purposeful. We should keep in mind that timbre, as well as other components of musical articulation, has another dimension which is contextually conditioned. Vocal performances of highly non-tempered in the domain of pitch and temporarily undefined in the domain of time or rhythm melodies, the level of noise very high on the majority of the recordings, since the recording conditions were not always perfect and it was often beyond my influence. And one may ask a question, but the same singers can sing the same song in a slightly different manner, and that will change the delicate balance and the result of measurements. And the answer is yes. And I started the research from the hypothesis that these measurements of the articulation components in more detail will set a solid ground for the articulatory performance analysis. And that is why my first job was to visualize in a certain software as many recordings as possible and to try to recognize and compare the visual patterns in the spectral displays and to discover which auditive happenings do they represent. And then the next step is to compare all typical and analyzed Pester examples with the neighboring examples typical for this neighboring area, for example, like this one from Montenegro, and to determine similarities, differences in the terms of engaging the articulatory features of sound. And it is a long and very difficult process, as you can assume. And then what with the measurements and the noticed features? It appears that the best solution is setting the binary opposition pairs in several different categories. And I had the inspiration again in the PhD thesis of Megan Levengood, who had her inspiration in the pioneering work of Robert Cogan, American music theorist and composer, who almost 40 years ago tried to set the methodological tools for analyzing timbre, and he found the theoretical justification for the usage of binary pairs in linguistics. So for now, two categories appear to be important, and those are time and frequency. One of the important features in analyzing timbre is the beginning of the pitch, the attack or the onset portion of the sound. Many characteristics of the tone are influenced by the way the sound or the sounding starts. Was it noisy or pure? Was it exact, punctual, or sliding, which is my working terms in this case? In this case of a time category, that, if you remember, time instance, markedness, will give some satisfactory results, I hope. Other elements viewed through the binary opposition will be dedicated to the overtones and formants, meaning the frequency properties. Are they full, hollow, active, passive, etc.? So setting binary oppositions is an appealing approach due to the fact that we are not acoustics, we are not mathematicians or physicists, and as Megan Levengood says, on this way we are avoiding overly technical vocabulary and using the common language terms that reflect the listener's experience. On the other hand, I would also like to investigate on which level determined particularities in the sound structure influence, or vice versa, the identification of my informants as Serbs from Pester. Are those the overtones in frequencies of sound during the performance what makes them as performers and me as a researcher able to interpolate? I'm borrowing this term from Ivan Enić, who developed this theoretical and methodological concept, and I will quote here that the interpolation is the moment of adoption, response, when we are taking an active part in a certain musical practice as the subjects, and which in turn can influence our other identificational matrices by questioning them or making them even stronger. With all said above, I have to conclude with my strong belief that the contemporary ethnomusicology lays on the necessity of inter-transdisciplinary communication, and that modern technological and computational improvements enables us to be even more meticulous in sound as our primary study object, as well as its repercussions and occurrences as someone's music somewhere. Thank you very much for your attention.